Good afternoon. Welcome. Thank you for joining us for the Boundless Potential Book Talk. I'm Alison Griffin, Senior Vice President at Whiteboard Advisors. We are a social impact agency that largely works at the intersection of entrepreneurship and innovation and public policy in education. I co-lead our post-secondary education practice from right outside Boulder, Colorado, and have the great pleasure of continuing a tradition that we started over actually the last 2 years at the very beginning of the pandemic, when we realized that we weren't all able to be together in social settings or education and information settings. And so we decided to stand up a virtual book talk and give authors, particularly those who are writing about topics in higher education and work, public policy specifically, the opportunity to join our network and join our community of listeners and followers and share their book, talk a little bit about what they've written, what's inspired their work, what they hope to inspire by writing that book. And today we're really excited. I've lost count. I think we might be at 10 book talks at this point. So really excited that actually over the course of the last 2 years, we've brought so many people together to share information and perspective. And today, the title of our book talk is called Unlocking Opportunity Through Broadly Accessible Institutions. And if you read our lead-in to the session today, you're already one step ahead of us, that perhaps those who are joining us sort of at the last minute might not know, but I want to give a full just description of what we're going to be talking about today. I'll introduce our panel and then we're going to dive right into questions. We will leave some time toward the latter half of our time together. We're scheduled for about an hour, but we'll leave about half an hour at the end for conversation across those of you who have joined and our authors and editors today. If you have questions while we're talking, just at the beginning of this talk, please feel free to use the chat box at the bottom of your screen and put your questions in the chat. It would also be great if you would identify yourself, perhaps what institution you're from, what organization you're from, and also your name or title. That'll help us just have a little bit of context for the question that you're asking. So today, we're going to be talking with the 4 authors, editors of the book that was previewed actually with me by one of the authors. Dr. Cecilia Orphan had mentioned to me a number of months ago that she had been collaborating with her colleagues to put this book together. And I have found that after reading it, which I have done over the last month, this really groundbreaking resource has highlighted the unique mission and purpose of broadly accessible institutions, or BAIs. And we'll be referring to broadly accessible institutions by the acronym throughout the talk today. I'm really exploring the challenges and opportunities that are present within these institutions and really offering a counterpoint to the current dialogue that frames these institutions with a deficit perspective. Coming to you from actually as a public institution trustee myself, so much of the book resonated with me when I think about the students that many of the BAIs are serving. Our first generation low-income students serving communities, whether rural or communities of color, but really how do we both establish strong leadership benches, but also programs and student supports, and then more importantly, how do we ensure that these institutions receive the designation or the recognition for their designation when we think about federal and state funding. So our panel today, let me welcome Dr. Gloria Crisp. She's a professor of adult and higher education at Oregon State University. Dr. Kevin McClure is an associate professor of higher education at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, and co-director of the Alliance for Research on Regional Colleges. Dr. Cecilia Orphan is an associate professor of higher education at the University of Denver and also co-director of the Alliance for Research on Regional Colleges. And Jorge Burmicky, an assistant professor of educational leadership and policy studies at Howard University. Welcome to our esteemed panel. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Cecilia, if I could, may I start with you? I'd like to start from the very top and ask you to describe what is a broadly accessible institution, or BAI, and how does the BAI differ from other institutional types?
I love this question because it's one that we center in this book, and it's something that we built on with a lot of Gloria Crisp's work to define and identify broadly accessible institutions. So in the book, we define them as being bachelor's degree granting institutions that have at least an 80% or higher admissions rate. Now, that's the kind of simplistic technical definition. But beyond that, and in the book throughout, we also consider the mission and the purpose of these institutions. And we look at those that either historically were founded to promote post-secondary access, or maybe evolved into that mission and do so contemporarily. And there are different types of institutions. So one thing we always like to think about in higher education research is how do we kind of identify different types of colleges and universities, and what can we learn once we create these categories from these institutions. So BAIs can be a lot of different types of institutions. They can be the regional public universities. I spend a lot of my time researching land grant institutions. Sometimes are BAIs given their access mission and depending on their admissions rates, minority serving institutions, and even bachelor's degree granting community colleges. So we're in a state where a large community college system, the Colorado Mountain College system, is now offering bachelor's degrees, and they would count as a BAI. And what makes these institutions unique? And so as I think the first thing I always think about, and the image that we chose for the book cover, I think conveys this, as other institutions are becoming more restrictive in who they admit and how many students they admit. The cover of the book has a line of doors, and one door is open and light is shining through. BAIs have bucked that trend and have committed to maintaining an access mission and being an open door to those who are seeking a college degree. They are the institutions that are educating the new majority, and their demographics, the student demographics and the faculty and staff demographics, more closely resemble the rich diversity that can be found in the United States, and often more closely resemble the diversity within their regions and communities, because they are, again, that open door, and they're drawing students. Most of them are drawing students from less than 100 miles away. And they really work to embrace their students in the local community. And it can mean at times a fluid and dynamic mission. And so sometimes they'll be accused of mission drift, but really we can think about it in terms of a mission expansion and adaptation to meet the changing needs of their students and their communities. One of the things that we did in the book, in the final chapter, and Kevin led this effort, was to create almost a model for how broadly accessible institutions do exactly that, promote broad access. And we saw it in 4 domains. The first is in a clear mission and identity around being a broadly accessible institution that can be captured in mission statements and strategic plans and the way people talk about their institutions. The second domain is in the student supports that they provide, so things like developmental education, robust tutoring, and academic support services, because often the students that they're enrolling they just benefit from more robust supports to be successful. The third domain being, and this again is that kind of simplistic definition, but commitment to having low barriers for admission. And then the fourth is promoting positive and equitable outcomes for students. And so why now? Why did we think that this was the time to publish this book? I think first and foremost, and you touched on this in your introductory remarks, but too often these institutions get framed in deficit-based ways. There's frequently news stories saying they're all going to close or they're not going to survive the enrollment cliff. And there's a lot of doomsday narratives around them, or just other kind of negative things that get said about them. So we really wanted to claim and articulate and draw on just the immense brilliance of the authors and researchers we pulled together for the book a unique niche, a unique mission, a unique purpose, and demonstrate the contributions that they make. And not to say that they get everything right or correct. And we have research reflected in the book that shows there are areas that they need to improve. But to say that this is a vital part of American higher education, and it does an incredible service to many, many students, despite some of the challenges that it faces. And for us, this is about promoting the legitimacy of the sector, to say that there is a there, and the there that's there is very important. And just to tell the story of how they unlock opportunity. And so the chapters kind of go into different types of BAIs and dig into how do these unique types of BAIs do that work. And really at the heart of this is the students. These are students that are often disenfranchised from other sectors or other types of colleges and universities. And these institutions truly exist to serve those students. And so we really wanted to surface and highlight that.
Thank you so much. I think, one of my greatest takeaways from both what you just shared, but really the book, is the community centeredness of so many of these institutions. And you said it, they're institutions that might be 80 or 100 miles in service to learners across a geographic region. And they also become the center point of communities. And if it weren't for these institutions, there might not be a city or a town in the same way that exists with these institutions being present. And I hope we dig into that a little bit more. But I'd like to turn, Gloria, to you. You wrote a chapter in the book about assumptions people make about BAIs. I feel like Cecilia touched on this a little bit, but I'd like to go a little deeper, explore with you what are some of those assumptions, some that you highlighted, and then how can we overcome some of those assumptions, both in policy, but also in practice?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks to Cecilia for setting me up for that to answer this question. I think it's an important question. Assumptions, such a problem for us in life, but more specifically in higher education. And my co-authors, Rebecca Robertson and Anthony Garrison Engelbrett, helped me to put together a chapter that we picked 3 assumptions. There's many, 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 many other problematic assumptions about these institutions, but we tackled 3 in the chapter. The first was that enough is known about broadly accessible institutions. We found a lot of evidence to suggest that, that researchers, policymakers, folks in the media, we think we know what these institutions are based on what they're not, right? Based on comparisons between more elite or community colleges. But it's a diverse set of institutions that looks very different. So that was one of the assumptions that we questioned in the chapter and sought to push back on. The second is that elite institutions, which I'll note, we call in the chapter exclusionary universities. I saw on social media this past week that somebody called them more rejective, which I kind of like that too, anyway. But these elite or exclusionary universities, that this assumption that they provide a higher quality educational experience, right? That the elites are the good and that all these other institutions then by default are the, not as good. And then also the third assumption that we question is that colleges and university are a homogenous and monolithic group. Certainly not the case, but we use national data, some IPEDS data to really paint a picture to show the diversity between more elite institutions and accessible institutions. So those are the 3 assumptions. Some of the, major findings are that, certainly our literature review identified way more questions than answers. If any of you all on the call are emerging scholars or doctoral students, we set out a full-on research agenda practically. Lots of good questions that could be answered if you're interested. But it really confirms this idea that we know very, very little, even at a descriptive level, about what these institutions are and how they're different from community colleges or exclusionary institutions, which is problematic. And then along those same lines, we found that these holes, in some cases, these holes in the assumptions are actually filled with problematic assumptions, right? And so there's even language in, in literature that says, accessible institutions probably, fill in the blank, some negative deficit-based, assumption. And so that was a problem. So we highlight a couple of those there. And then, like I mentioned, a key finding was, to show just descriptively the important ways in which, in terms of course, financial characteristics, as well as student characteristics, faculty characteristics, and other just institutional characteristics, how really our accessible institutions, our regional institutions, many of our minority serving institutions, these little private institutions, they really characteristically look very much more similar to community colleges than they do, this very small percentage of exclusionary institutions that everybody thinks of when they think of colleges and universities, and the ways in which that's a problem, right? And then we also try to highlight that, and our findings suggest that these broadly accessible institutions, as Cecilia was sharing, that we really play a critical role in national efforts to maintain college affordability and accessibility. I live 80 miles one way from work, and I was driving to work. I listened to lots of podcasts. I was listening to Freakonomics today. I don't know if any of y'all listened to that, but they had an episode on like, what's the point of college or something? I forgot what the title, some compelling title to get you to listen to it, right? And they were actually talking about accessible institutions. So if you haven't checked that out, they don't use this language, right? But rather, in their economists who run this, and that's who the speakers are. But the podcast was labeling accessible institutions as mid-tier, I think, is what they just lumped together. Everything that isn't at a community college or an elite institution, they called mid-tier. And then interestingly, they really, a lot of these assumptions came out in the podcast about, institutional quality. And yeah, so just plug for that. It sounds like it's a series. And so that was the first in the series. So I look forward to listening to that. But in terms of your the second part of your question, and then I'll give space to others, in terms of, how do we overcome these assumptions? To me, I think a starting place, and really what prompted us to put together this book and bring together scholars to think and start writing about these institutions, is to overcome the assumptions. I think we need to be aware of the assumptions, right? Both, as a field, then even us as individuals, we all have assumptions about these institutions, good and bad, based on right and wrong, right? Some with more evidence or less evidence based on our own positionalities and experiences. And so, maybe just encourage us all to take a little bit of time to think about, what our assumptions are, and the ways in which that this is, these assumptions might positively, negatively, and otherwise influence our decision-making, and us as faculty, us as leaders, us as, parents of people, folks making decisions. I have a 12-year-old, and believe it or not, we're already kind of moving in that direction. And so I think that there's salience in this conversation for everybody, regardless of who you are, and, your place within education. But, there's so many assumptions. Cecilia's research, that, we're really going into the idea that, all institutions are striving, right, to be these elite institutions, this assumption that it's best for students to attend the most selective college. So I would encourage us all to give some space to thinking about the ways in which that's problematic.
Absolutely. I have so many, I've made a couple of notes. I have so many just anecdotal ideas to explore. I too have a 12-year-old and 14-year-old, and we talk about what you do after high school a lot. But I will also say you should send the Freakonomics team a copy of your book. Perhaps that will inform the language use in a future podcast. So with that, actually, Kevin, I want to turn to you. I feel like, we have a strong foundation for the BAIs from Cecilia. Gloria has given us an overview of the work she and her colleagues did around assumptions. And now I would love to know, from your perspective, what is the counter narrative to BAIs? How does public policy, whether at the federal level or the state level, support or even inhibit BAIs really as opportunity creating institutions. Who's competing with the BAI? Are they competing with them with themselves? Can you help us understand some of that?
So I might start at the end and then work my way backwards. Because I was thinking about this question around, what are the institutions that BAIs are competing with? And where I ultimately landed with it is I think that BAIs are probably competing most against A, bad public policy, and B, poverty. And what I mean by that is I don't know that these are institutions that are necessarily in the competitive environment in the same way that some of these highly rejective institutions are. They are certainly, of course, interested in trying to meet enrollment goals and be sustainable as institutions. But because of the focus on access, I think the kind of manifestations of competition just look a little bit different. And if there's something that is what is perhaps making it difficult for them to fully lean into that mission is, I think, public policy. And what probably makes what taxes them the most or can be most difficult as they move forward is the fact that they are trying to counteract a set of societal problems and policies that can make it incredibly difficult for Americans to enter into and be successful in higher education. So kind of on the policy front, these are institutions that on the public side, at least, have suffered from state defunding, and institutions that have often not benefited from some of the performance-based funding models that have come out, particularly those that don't do a great job of building in kind of equity metrics or accounting for the types of students that these institutions serve. So if you've got funding formulas that are heavily rewarding success that's defined in terms of kind of retention completion, credit hours completed, et cetera, and you've got students who are walking into higher education who are facing a number of barriers to being able to stay and persist until graduation, you are going to be disadvantaging the institutions that are serving those students. And so those are policies in particular that I think inhibit BAIs from being able to be the kind of engines of opportunity that we see them being capable of being. The other ways in which I think these institutions intersect with policy, there are a couple of that come to mind. One is obviously we as a country are walking into a couple of years of recovery, at least a couple of years of recovery. And there are communities that have suffered tremendously. Many have been distressed and been struggling after years of manufacturing loss, systematic disinvestment. And these are institutions, many of them that are positioned to be critical anchor institutions in those communities and can be strategic means of investment in infrastructure that serves communities really well and can help as part of that recovery. And so as a way of dialing up the possibility for BAIs as opportunity creating institutions, there's I think a chance or a way for governments to get involved in investing in them as anchor institutions for communities that have often been neglected. The other thing that's worth noting is obviously we've had lots of conversations about college completion in the United States. And in one of the chapters, the calculation was that BAIs are responsible for about a third of all the bachelor's degrees that are produced in this country. And that's really, to be honest with you, with BAIs that are probably even not meeting their full potential when it comes to kind of student success metrics like completion. So there's room for improvement there. With the right kind of investment, if we wanted to really see progress on college completion, I think this is a sector where we could really see a huge difference being made. but that investment has to be there. You've got to believe in these institutions and what they're capable of doing. And in some ways, in some cases, that means that there are institutions that are receiving more money than they may need. They're doing fine. And we may need to strategically reinvest a larger sum of money in these institutions that are focused on access. So in terms of like policy implications, I'll kind of leave it there. We as a group really challenged all of the authors to think in terms of how do we tell the story of these institutions using data, but also in a way that doesn't fall back on those deficit perspectives. And so many of them brought forward really great data and insights into these institutions, but did it in a way that recognized the strengths that they bring. And so from that, we were able to craft this counter narrative of BAIs. And in the book, what we do is basically delineate 7 kind of key parts of that counter narrative. And it includes things like these are institutions that are key to advancing racial equity. Yes. They are they make critical place-based contributions, especially for people who don't have the ability to travel long distances to access college. And what we're basically trying to do is in some ways provide a different way of thinking about these institutions and their potential.
Yeah, we need some strong storytelling support as well as next to that investment. So I've found a lot of times, and this was came through in the book as well, there's some really incredible stories of institutions and the impact that they're having on learners and communities. And there are many examples that we, just don't hear about all the time. And so I think sometimes it's elevating that story just as much as it is ensuring that resource and other supports are there. And one resource that I really want to hone in on is presidential leadership. And Jorge, I know you co-authored a chapter about presidential leadership with Kevin. Tell us a little bit more about who the leaders are of these institutions, or who should they be? Give us a sense of some key characteristics of the BAI presidential candidate.
Yeah, so that's a great question, and it's a difficult one to answer because even when you find pieces or works that are focused on presidential leadership, they may not necessarily specify whether they were taking place in that particular sector, right? So one of the challenges, so the second question that you asked, who should be leading BAIs, given what we now know, now that my colleagues have very well explained, the challenges and the context. That is actually the question that we were able to best answer by looking at the literature, because as we know, this concept can be widely misunderstood or misapplied. So it is, a lot of the work, again, may not be very specific to presidential leadership in this sector. So as a result, we looked at 53 pieces of literature and see how these pieces can actually inform which goes back to your question, who should be leading BAIs? And that was actually a very helpful exercise to do, because we were not only able to expand on the literature and also the practice of presidential leadership broadly, but then also focus our implications more specifically to this sector. So I'll talk a little bit about those who should be leading BAIs, because I think that's sort of the heart of your question, and what I think is actually a really good one, considering all the context and background that my colleagues have already provided. So one of the things that we learn and we framed as key takeaways, and I'll just summarize them, is that in many ways, and we know this from research, is that institutions tend to hire from other institutions that look or function like them, right? So they tend to hire in silos. But that may not actually be as helpful, particularly as the needs of these institutions continue to change. And something that my colleagues highlighted very well is that oftentimes bad policy makes these institutions work all the more difficult. So you really have to have, in particular right now with so much evolving and so much retirement, so much presidential turnover, it's really critical that institutions think about who should be leading our institutions given the challenges that we're facing, not just with the pandemic, but really all the things that have been building up, again, as a result of bad policy sometimes, as a result of deficit narratives that do not help these institutions, even though they're doing a lot of the heavy lifting for a lot of these communities in which where they're at. So one of the things, one of the takeaways that we drew is that BAIs could actually benefit quite a bit from not just hiring, but also the knowledge that is at the community college sector, which Gloria touched on a bit, but then also some MSI settings. And the reason why we talked a lot about this is when you consider about the demographics and also challenges that many community colleges have are actually quite similar than many of the challenges that you see in rural BAIs and a lot of BAIs that are facing very, very similar challenges and are actually serving very similar populations, all very diverse, but certainly these leaders from these institutions are already developing the portfolio that it takes to be leading some of these institutions, which, why reinvent the wheel when you're already getting the training that you're getting at these institutions? And another thing that we know is, particularly community colleges, they not only tend to serve very diverse student populations, adult learners, all kinds of different populations, but as a result of that, who they serve, they develop very innovative ways to serve these students adequately. So those are skills that are very much welcome in BAI settings. But then also they tend to be very, in touch. And I'm very much, speaking of community colleges very broadly, by the way. But, at the local level, you do have a lot of the work that happens with local partnerships because you have to really keep up with, workforce, the workforce and also labor market needs, right? So you really have to have leaders that understands the problems, as well as, of course, enrollment fluctuations, which is critical. The other thing is, drawn from leaders from certain MSI settings, and I'm specifically here thinking of, for instance, HBCUs. HBCUs have, for their entire history, dealt with chronic disinvestment of their institutions from both the federal and state levels. So they understand what it's like to run with very, very limited funds, if any at all. So what we also know is that because institutions tend to hire from leaders that, again, either look like them or from similar institutions, oftentimes these leaders that are having these backgrounds that could really, really very well lead these institutions are not even considered as a part of the pool of candidates that are considered oftentimes for presidential searches. Mm-hmm. So we see a lot of even discrimination between sectors that are just really not benefiting anybody. Because again, when it comes to something like, for instance, state appropriations and disinvestments, HBCUs really do know the struggle about this. And there's very, very few that have not been able to, again, come up with leaders that are able to carry the mission of these institutions that very much transfers to the mission and particularly the mission of access that BAIs have. And the other thing very quickly I'll say, another thing is that when we looked at the research on presidential leadership, a lot of the research was focused on women who are presidents or have been presidents. And something that we have learned is that although women have been systematically excluded from the executive leadership ranks, as a result of that, they have developed very comprehensive portfolios. And as research shows, a high level of discernment and non-hierarchical leadership approaches that are actually very relevant to the needs of BAIs, particularly when you look at women of color who have been completely excluded from the highest ranks of leadership in higher education. And we continue to see data on this. Of course, we have made some improvements, but it's still there. But as a result of this, we certainly see, and the literature supports this, that the portfolios that many of these leaders are developing are really quite relevant to the needs of BAIs. And last, I think you talked a little bit about advice for aspiring presidents. I think and again, also what we found from our review, there's no need to reinvent the wheel. There's a lot of associations like ASCU, the American Association for State Colleges and Universities, the American Association for Community Colleges, that are developing competencies rubrics for aspiring leaders. And, for anyone who's really interested in leading these types of institutions, there's a lot of those resources, as well as the American Council on Education and a lot of the leadership institutes that are now, more specific about, with historically marginalized populations. I think there's a lot of resources and organizations that are developing competency rubrics to be able to understand what it takes to be leading these institutions.
Thank you so much. It just strikes me as I was listening to your response that individuals who have experience in complex organizations, perhaps over those who have gone very deep in a single discipline, might be, I don't know what maybe not stronger, but maybe have a little bit of an advantage when you think about the needs of a BAI. So not to discount deep subject matter knowledge in one discipline, but some of the characteristics that you were describing seem to be, for me, individuals who have been at higher levels of leadership, but perhaps not been in an office of the president or even been a provost, but really know how to navigate in a complex organization, could bring a lot to a BAI. And I think that helps to also expand the pool and deepen the bench of potential leadership candidates. So thank you for your insights there, Jorge. I have a few more questions, but given that we're a little bit beyond the top of the hour, I do want to open up the conversation to our group, because we promised a conversation, not just a talk. So I'm going to unpin everyone here so we can all at least be in the same, I guess, sort of setup, if you will. And if you're joining us today virtually and you have a question for any of our contributors, any of our authors, please feel free to come off your camera or come on the screen and ask your question. Give everyone just a second. It's always hard to be the first one.
Happy to jump in and just want to start by saying thank you so much. This is such a fabulous discussion, and I'm keeping myself off camera because I have a tendency to turn into a bobblehead when I listen, and I would have just been nodding the entire time, particularly around equity and really supporting students and the majority of students, which is overlooked. And Alison, particularly appreciate your point about storytelling as well, and wanted to hear a bit about that as it relates to funding and just what you're seeing in the field around, I want to, and I'm so sorry, I just realized I jumped in without even introducing myself. My name is Piper Hendricks. I'm the Vice President of Communications and External Affairs at IHEP, the Institute for Higher Education Policy. And so this is just squarely in all that we do. And I'd love to believe that there's more of a focus now and growing support for completion and recognition of what it really takes to get people over the degree finish line, but would like to hear from your perspective, what's working and where do we still have space to grow?
Would any of you like to jump in first? Kevin, I saw you come off mute.
Well, I thought I saw Gloria go. Gloria, do you want to start? And I can say something after you.
Okay, I just have one quick reaction to that, and that is several years ago, some colleagues and I did a study predicting graduation rates at broadly accessible institutions, and let's guess what the predictor was. Money, right? The schools with the better well-resourced magically had higher graduation rates, and often better graduation rates than the more elite institutions. And so back to Kevin's point, we need investment in these institutions.
Kevin, any other reflections?
Yeah, I was just going to follow up on that, which is to say, I think part of the deficit perspective that we bring to these institutions is connected to the conflation of access and institutional low performance. But we never really come to terms with the fact that institutional low performance is partly a function of systematic disinvestment. And in some states, just outright racist policies around funding. And so we can look at the graduation rates of BAIs, but in some ways, I think that they are not really reflective of what's possible. They're reflective of the system as it has been designed. And if you underfund a set of institutions for long enough, and this is the kind of the numbers that you're seeing, and you don't change that, then I'm not sure kind of what else one can expect to see. You can only squeeze so much basically out performance-wise. And similar to Gloria's point, I've done some research on regional public universities around cost efficiency, and in particular cost efficiency when it comes to degree production. And what we found is that they are incredibly cost efficient. And the only way that you are possibly going to get more completion is by increasing the amount of resources that they have available to them. The other thing I'll note is that I think, broadly speaking, the philanthropic sector has not been active enough in supporting these institutions. And it'll be very interesting to see kind of what happens with some of the Mackenzie Scott giving around kind of massive infusions of unrestricted funds, to see how institutions could translate that into student success in really creative ways. There is, I think, broadly speaking, a skepticism around some of these institutions that they are not worthy of investment because they haven't proven themselves to be worthy of investment. And so as a consequence of that, we see approaches to philanthropy and state policy that I think don't adequately recognize what the institutions could do. And so that's what I'd like to see. I'd like to say, let's give it a shot. Let's see what happens when we fund these institutions equitably and in a way that recognizes the possibilities around degree completion, and see what happens with it.
I'll just add to that, it may be a positive development, but still with a lot of caveats, is that a number of states are experimenting with performance-based funding models and formulae that have weights in them for students of color and low-income students and Pell recipients. It's a positive thing because that's the critical mass of students that are attending BAIs. The challenge, though, and I saw this in some research I did in Ohio a while ago, and they had similar weights in place. And what they found, what I saw happening is Ohio State started targeting those student groups more intentionally, which on the one hand is good for the students to have options and opportunities and have the option of going to Ohio State or their local regional. But on the other hand, what that did was it hit the enrollment of some of the regionals. And so that's kind of one of the caveats, or the unintended consequences, or intended, depending on who you talk to, because I think many policymakers do want to generate competition among institutions. But one downside of that is then you have institutions that maybe are not as well set up to support the success of marginalized students, targeting those students because they'll get a benefit through performance funding. Those students get to campus, and we know the stories. A lot of times they're not experiencing the most welcoming environments. They're being kind of pigeonholed into a more traditional education when they don't have traditional student lives. So there's a benefit there, but also some caveats that I think are important to mention.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Piper, for your question and for jumping in first. It's good to see you. Are there other questions?
I'm happy to follow Piper. My name is Marcella. I'm a senior fellow at CAP, Center for American Progress in DC, and really appreciate this fantastic conversation. Just like this is such important work. I was curious to ask a little bit more. Oh, and I apologize, there's a very unhappy child in the background, so if you hear squealing. I was curious to ask about like the federal angle, and I think Alison, you actually floated the idea of like a designation for BAIs. Like, is that something that the authors think would make sense? And like, how much overlap? And I apologize if I missed this, but how much overlap is there with like with MSI designations that already exist? And like, so how helpful would it be to like, increase funding for those institutions.
Thoughts from our authors on a federal designation?
Just jump in quickly. We have seen more movement. At first, in the Obama administration, we saw a federal focus developing around community colleges, which was incredible because they were ignored for so long. And then towards the end of his administration and in the Trump administration, we see more funding and more focus on minority serving institutions. Most public four-year MSIs are also regional public universities, also have that regional service mission. So they are captured there. But beyond that, there hasn't, to my knowledge, been any federal legislation or designation. When you look at iPads, there's no indicator for that other than if you pull the enrollment or the admissions rates, and you can kind of do the indexing yourself. I do think there would be benefit personally, and I don't know, I would be curious what my co-authors think, but to having some kind of designation and some guaranteed funding. The challenge with the MSI grants that we've learned through that program is that those MSIs that have more robust grant offices of grants can go after those grants in ways that smaller MSIs just can't. And so that's a structural inequity that's just reifying, as Jorge had mentioned, generations of inequitable funding. So that's where I know the government loves challenge grants and loves competitive processes. And I don't know how to break us out of that, but I just worry that it would just continue to stratify the sector if it wasn't just a guaranteed line of funding. But that's a tough sell because there are a lot of institutions that would be counted as BAIs.
Yeah. So maybe I could throw in a question. Thank you, Marcella, so much for joining us and for your question. I had wanted to ask the authors about the American, we're talking about, designations, and we're just referencing federal designations, but what if we look at the Carnegie classification? So the American Council on Education, has recently announced their acquisition or integration of the Carnegie classification system. So I'm curious, what do you think even this new partnership between ACE and Carnegie might have in the context of BAIs and recognizing BAIs in that classification system, perhaps in a way that they aren't as robustly recognized currently?
I was just going to say I think it's been really interesting because whoever's going to be in charge of the new Carnegie classification is going to have quite a task ahead of them, because I feel like we keep on thinking up new ways to add to their to-do list. But one of the challenges at play, I think there's potential. I think it could be really interesting to add something that might allow somebody to easily access a list of broadly accessible institutions, and then through that we can advance our research. We've used that 80% admissions threshold metric because it's an easy way of kind of maybe getting at a group of institutions and studying them. But as we note in the book, there are some limitations to that. There are institutions that are, well, anyway, there are other ways, I think, of getting at broad accessibility. And so I think in order for it to get included in something like the Carnegie classifications, that we might have to figure out some way of operationalizing broad accessibility. And we've done some of that work at the Alliance for Research on Regional Colleges that builds in a couple of different variables that could arrive at a new metric for broad accessibility. But even that, there's a whole conversation that could be had around whether that's the right way of doing it. And so I think we probably got some work to do before we get to that point, but I do think there's some potential for it.
That's helpful. I know, Gloria, when you and I spoke in advance of this conversation just about the book, you noted to me that there's already I don't remember what the words were. Can you recall for me? There is a sort of designation through the Carnegie system where the BAIs might fall under.
Yeah, they do have a label and a designation for inclusive institutions. That's a language that they've used, which, lots of parallels between, how we're conceptualizing and defining broadly accessible and inclusive institutions. So I think there's definitely potential there, but I appreciate my colleagues' thoughtful comments about, there's implications that this would need to be thoughtful. I think whatever happens needs to be thoughtful and consider both intended and unintended consequences on these institutions.
Okay, did you want to jump into that? I said, Jorge, did you want to jump in?
I thought you said Allison, I'm sorry. Something that I was going to quickly add is particularly with some of these not so helpful narratives around the R1 conversation. Some of the conversations, particularly we've had with some of my colleagues here at Howard and other HBCUs in particular, and other MSIs, is when it comes to the mission and capacity of some of these institutions. And what happens to these institutions when you start chasing that designation as a result of deficit narratives around prestige and elitism. A lot of these institutions, their capacity was built on, again, access, but then also some of the service that is around these communities that have been systematically excluded from higher education. So then when you add this sort of almost toxic conversation about the whole chasing R1 designation, it can be quite harmful to even some of the work, the ongoing work that happens with faculty workloads and staff workloads because of chasing this so-called prestige that the R1 designation is believed to give you, right? And I think something that Cecilia mentioned earlier that is very real is that, there are some institutions that are, R1 institutions that then they achieve their MSI designation, particularly when it comes to many, particularly with HSIs around the country, but they have, grant seeking capacity, the capacity to actually secure these large grants that should honestly be going, towards MSIs that could really benefit from that, but will never be able to compete because they don't have this sort of organizational capacity that takes years, if not decades, to build. So I do think that being intentional about who we mean by these institutions is really critical. So it doesn't really hinder some of the mission that these institutions have been carrying, for instance, when it comes to teaching, service, and access. Because I do think that the whole R1 conversation could be really toxic for some of these institutions, if not being thoughtful and intentional about it.
Really good reminder. Thank you to all of you for your comments on that question and reflection there. And thanks, Marcella, again, for getting us started by thinking about designation. Are there any other questions?
I had a comment.
Great. Thank you, Abel.
My name is Abel Gonzalez. I'm Director of Instructional Outreach in the College of Education at the University of Texas at San Antonio. So Dr. Crisp, great to see you. Jorge, you made a comment I think that really resonates with me in talking about the innovative strategies to support student success. And I just think about how difficult that is in a large institution with a lot of bureaucratic process, right? You have to manage all of those things. And how we fail in responsiveness to the needs of our students. We've almost lost, in some terms, innovation because of this large overlay, this large organizational overlay that limits our ability to react in time. I'm just wondering how many students we lose day to day, but in reality is that how we really need to embrace the innovation, and that becomes a buzzword. We just received R1 Carnegie designation, but in reality is that how are we being innovative in response to the needs of our students to support their success? And also is R1, and I understand your comment completely in this designation where you say that Carnegie R1 could become toxic. It's like, it seems to be the flavor that we discuss most often, but in reality, where are the students? What does this mean to students? And specifically for access initiatives that I'm focused on is that, what are we doing to better serve them through this designation?
I was thinking specifically of institutions like the UTSAs, who just under the new classification achieve the latest achieve R1 status, right? Which is, lots of celebration around that. But then I was also thinking not so long ago about some of that, going back to your point of innovative work that was happening at UTSA, to serve documented and undocumented students, which I deeply admire, particularly when you consider the population of San Antonio and really all of Texas, right? So I worry that that innovative spirit, and I remain optimistic, but I do think that the intentionality about what is the purpose, mission, and function of these institutions, particularly when you're thinking of UTSA and San Antonio, and the students that are serving that the critical work that happens at the student success level, particularly with populations like undocumented, immigrant, documented students. For instance, I'm just thinking specifically of UTSA because I'm very familiar with the work that happens at the student level. Yeah, I think sometimes it could be distracting, right? At the same time, there is a lot to applaud, UTSA for all the work. I know it's been a long journey, right? So it's not something that you're saying, okay, this is all bad, because I do know of the hard work that faculty and research and everything have gone to achieve that. And I do also know, having come very recently from Texas, the pressure that many BAIs are having to achieve this status, right? So I'm very familiar, but I do wonder, I asked the question that you're asking, what happens to student success and innovation and support? I don't know the answer, but I think it's a really good one to consider.
So glad you surfaced that question. I know we only have about 5 minutes, and I'd like to leave us on an optimistic thread. So I'm going to ask each one of our contributors, and I'm going to I'll call on each of you. What, given all the work that you have done and put into this book, your research, your collective work in the field of post-secondary education, what gives you hope? Having contributed and edited this book, coming out of this conversation today, what gives you hope? Cecilia, I'll start with you.
2 things. One is the students that these institutions serve. It's just incredible. I mean, I get emotional when I think about, and I was one of those students, all that they balanced while pursuing their dreams, and how they bring their families with them to campus, and how the campuses work despite the odds to support their dreams and foster their growth. So that the students really give me hope. And the second is I don't know if it's necessity being the mother of invention, just incredibly smart, capable, innovative leaders in the sector. But I've written about the paradoxical nature of prestige, and that prestigious institutions are not innovative. In fact, they're incentivized to maintain tradition and be the same over generations. The innovation really comes from BAIs. And so I take a lot of hope from just seeing the different things that they do. I always say, whenever I am able to learn more about what's going on in the regional public university sector, it's like an Easter egg hunt, because there's always something incredible going on that often doesn't reach public consumption, but is truly innovative. So those 2 things give me hope.
Thank you so much. Kevin?
Yeah, there's really interesting conversations happening right now around upward mobility and return on investments. And Cecilia and I have been writing about this recently, so it's fresh in my mind. And so the cynical side of me says that those conversations are drifting in the wrong direction, and they're placing too much emphasis on individual economic returns to higher ed. But at the same time, when you start to take a look at what might be at the heart of some of those conversations around, where is some of the value within our higher education system, you start to see some alignment between that and what we identified as the ways in which BAIs create opportunity. And so I like to think that we're in kind of a unique moment right now where there are a lot of people across policy communities and philanthropic communities and practice communities that are saying, this is where there's really an opportunity for us to make a big difference. And so let's do something here. And so I think many of us have felt in the last couple of years that there's interest in this sector of institutions that wasn't there even 5 years ago. And so that's exciting. And I hope it continues.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Jorge.
Sorry, I got to unmute myself. I'm very optimistic about the next generation of leaders in higher education. I really am. And part of it is because right now, something that the pandemic in particular has made us think more about is about our workspaces. What are our workspaces? How are we approaching work? What makes us productive? What makes us happy? What makes us fulfill? Why are people leaving? I think these questions are actually needed, and I think they're overdue. And I think what's creating is for the next generation of leaders to think about what can be my contribution to be more helpful and healthy, rather than just kind of doing this the same old. You know, we've known from research that many institutions have sort of recycled presidents from one institution to another. I think we're going to break that cycle. I think institutions really do believe that we need new leaders. We need leaders of tomorrow, not leaders of yesterday, right? I think that our institutions are changing so rapidly, and I think that we're thinking very critically about what we need to ensure that we are happy, that our students are served well, that we're not just leaving en masse and not doing anything about it. I think that we're going to see a new wave of new leaders that are ready and up for the task. And I'm very hopeful for that. And I do think that that's coming.
Thank you so much. Gloria, I'll let you have the last word.
Same. Yeah. I mean, like Cecilia, you know, I'm a product of these institutions, a very proud graduate of these institutions. And, you know, they're the heart, they're the community, they're the, you know, they are the future, right, of the country. And then Jorge, you know, I teach in a leadership program in the last couple of years. I think, you know, everything going on in the country and the pandemic and racial unrest and things, but the leaders that are coming to us that are wanting to be executive leaders in higher education, it's moving. They're different and in the best possible way, and they're gonna you know, bring us forward and lead these institutions. So I'm thrilled. Yeah.
Thank you all. You have left us with a tremendous amount of hope and optimism, and you have contributed mightily to the field just with your research alone. So thank you for that contribution. Thank you for joining us this evening. I put, for the benefit of all of our attendees, a link to the book. I do encourage you to not just listen to the Cliff Notes version here tonight, but in true academic spirit, please get a copy of the book and spend some time this summer reading it and reflecting on it. Again, thank you, Cecilia, Kevin, Jorge, Gloria, for joining us. Really great to be with everyone this evening. Be well, everyone.
Thank you.